I think what I gained at, so if from New Jersey, if I sort of got a heart for the invisible people, at Calvin, I sort of got a heart for trying to hold two things that are pushing against each other in tension.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Burn Power, coming to you on a bright, sunny day with a few clouds here in Tbilisi, Georgia. And looks like summer's not quite done with us yet, but we're not getting the super high heat we had a couple of weeks ago. But it's warm today, so some people are really glad about that. I'm waiting for the cooler weather. Too much time in Alaska, I think. Well, today we've got another in our series of Anadromous dialogues. Anadromous, by the way, for those of you who might just be tuning in, means, well, it's what salmon do. Salmon are considered an anadromous fish, and that is they are born in freshwater, swim out to sea, sometimes as far as Japan, that's even further, isn't it, from Alaska, and then swim all the way back to Alaska and spawn in the same little stream that they were born in. And so anadromous, as I'm using it, means to swim back against the stream on your way home. So what we're going to do is we're going to have an anadromous dialogue with Paul VanderKlay. Before we do hit like or subscribe or share this, and if you wish to contribute anything, please do. If you contribute more than $50 at one pop or $10 a month, you can get about 10 hours worth of audio extras, which to the person or two who just subscribed, they will be coming to you very soon. And you can do that by clicking on the PayPal link. So, Paul VanderKlay, I suppose if you're clicking on this, you may already know who Paul VanderKlay is. He has his own YouTube channel. Go check it out. There will be a link below. And Paul was one of the people who I would say was inspirational in getting me to start a YouTube channel. He wasn't the only one. I watched Jordan Peterson and other people, but I saw that Paul had his ideas and he was just sharing them. I found him because of the usual way people found Paul, certainly in the beginning, was that he was talking about Christianity and Jordan Peterson's relationship to it. And so I got in touch with him at one point, and I had already decided to start a channel. I had put a couple of short videos. My first two videos here are very short, believe it or not. And I told him, hey, I've got this interesting history. I had heard him talking about Francis Schaeffer. So I said, hey, I know something about that. You want to talk? And he was like, sure. And he said, and you have an interesting biography, which, if you watch my first discussion with him, I deflected away from because it's just too long and too involved. And if you do get interested in my biographical past, you can check out my autobiographical Q&A. But no, one of the things I notice is Paul loves to do interviews with people. And of course, there are different kinds of people he does interviews with. He actually interviewed Jordan Peterson once, but he also interviews, people who just get in touch with him who are, just like any of us, just somebody, but not anybody in particular. So I wanted to, I figured one thing that Paul always does is ask people about their past and their biography. Now, I figured I would turn it around. Since I'm interested in history, I thought Paul has been doing enough things to warrant us knowing a little bit more about his background. So that's what this is Paul graciously said, sure, I will do an interview on your channel about your background, and this is that. So enjoy it. It is long, as you can tell, but you wouldn't expect anything less, would you? One of the nice things about this, though, is that if you want to just listen to it and not pay attention to the visual images, it's an easy easy discussion to do that with. More of a podcast style, you might say, because I don't use a lot of imagery, or hardly any at all. And anyway, without any further ado, Paul VanderKlay.
Hey, Bern.
Yeah, I feel like I should switch the sides here. Sometimes, you have it so that you're facing the wrong way as the person. You've seen those, right?
Yeah.
It's just the way it goes.
It's so Zoom, you can move the screens around.
Wow.
But what I've learned is that on my screen right now, I'm facing away from you, but
right.
On the recording, it'll be the other way. So
okay, very good. Yeah, that's right, because you're usually on the other side. So there you go. Clever. Yeah, well, I'm still pretty new to this. What should we call it? Teleconferencing? Use an old usage. So how are you doing today? How's life?
Doing okay. Mondays are always a little. I always forget that when I get to church, we use a lot of the same equipment on Sundays as I do during the week for recording.
Right.
So when I get to work on Monday morning, it's like, oh,
you got to drag it back quickly. Yeah. Well, that's how it goes, isn't it? What? Yeah. Well, I'm doing okay. The weather finally broke from, it'd been in the upper 90s for, it seemed like 3 months. And then finally it's down like 75 degrees, getting down to like 60 at night. And I'm like, and everybody else, all the other Georgians are all going, oh. And I'm sitting there going like, hey, we're just entering my time now. The next 7 months are mine. You can have those 3.
All those years in Alaska. I can't imagine.
Exactly. So I figured what we would do is, you always interview people, and you always like, tell me your story. But no one ever interviews you that way. Although I have heard a few interviews, and they usually go something like, so Paul is a pastor. He has this church, Living Stones. He also has a YouTube channel. He discovered Jordan Peterson, blah, 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 Estuary, interviews, etc. And off you go. And it's usually a shorter introduction. And I really love history, and I love finding out the history of people. And I think much as you do, it's just like, it's really fascinating. So I figured like, there's all these questions about Paul that I think would be interesting, not only for myself, but for others to hear. And I think the general outline that a lot of people get is, Dutch background, Paterson, New Jersey, Calvin College, Dominican Republic, Sacramento, Living Stones, discovers Jordan Peterson. Hi, how are you? And that's like the Paul story in a nutshell. But I suspect there's more hidden around.
There's always more.
There's always more. I mean,
actually, when my father wrote a little bit of a memoir right after he retired, it's not a small memoir, but a lot of my stories, of course, built into that story because that's my father's story. And
I'm going to get there very soon. So
okay, I'll let you lead. I'll shut up and follow.
Yeah, that's all right. What year were you born? I'm guessing like about 67, 68?
63.
63. You're a little older than what? Are you like? Yeah. Okay. 63. Very good. So just born in time to have Kennedy die and you be totally unconscious of it. You were just talking about that with September 11th.
Yep.
And where were you born?
Paterson.
So you've been in Paterson all your life, and your father was a minister. Tell us about why did he go into ministry, and how long has your family been in the Dutch Reformed tradition. Also, I know we'll discuss the Jewish roots in a moment, but tell me a bit about the family background in the Dutch Reformed Christian tradition.
Well, it has to do somehow with the Jewish thing, because my father's grandfather immigrated to Western Michigan when he was 18 or 19 in order, it looks like, to pull. So he went through Ellis Island and then went to Western Michigan.
When was that?
That was towards the end of in the 1890s. So then he pulled his father, his mother, and a couple other family members came through. But when they went to one of these years, I want to get back to Spring Lake, which is where they settled, because there'll be records in the Spring Lake Christian Reformed Church about them.
Is that near Grand Rapids?
It's closer to Muskegon. And they I don't know what happened in that family. Actually, because of the Holocaust, the Jews keep quite good records and genealogies. And I don't know what happened in that family, but they left the Netherlands and not very many around them did. So is it because they basically got kicked out of the Jewish community or what? So then when they went to Western Michigan, not unlike many other immigrants, they assimilated in with the church is the dominant place where, you're going to be with your people, which are, people from the Northern Netherlands.
Well, was your, now we're talking about your grandfather here or great grandfather?
My great grandfather came over.
So was he Jewish purely?
It's hard to tell. I don't know if my great great grandfather married a Frisian girl or a Dutch girl. It kind of looks like it. And that could have been the reason why they were no longer part of the Jewish community. I don't know how far back that goes or what that history looks like.
Are we talking about a VanderKlay here?
They're all VanderKlays.
Right. Yeah, I guess you probably get your height from the Frisians. They're pretty tall people. Yeah.
So they settled in Western Michigan, and my great grandfather settled down to, this is the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, to have a big family. And his first wife, who he met in Western Michigan, she died in childbirth with the sixth child. And my grandfather, I believe, is the second child. And it's really interesting because if you go back enough generations, you can see how the patronymic naming system was there in the Jewish family. You would always name someone after a relative. The last name seemed to be a total, someone made them get last names. And so they just sort of made it up. And then it's interesting because the courthouse in Spring Lake burned down. The story that I'm told, that the courthouse burned down. And so all of the birth records of my grandfather's siblings, him and his siblings, were lost. And at that point, they broke the patronymic system and took American names that were sort of like the names that the ancestors had. So my grandfather's oldest brother, he was Hartog. He became Harm. And my grandfather was Hyman. He became Hiram.
Right.
And then when they went to school,
Harm a normal name?
I know. Or Hiram, a Hyman, But then when, nobody had birth records. And so when they went to the school, basically the kids just vouched for each other. Yeah, that's who he is. Yeah, that's who they are. And that's how, they all sort of, but then when my father's biological grandmother died, my great grandfather had 6 children, young children, and no wife. He was a house painter, an artist. He liked doing landscape paintings, and he had the woman who died, she had a brother who was married to a woman, and her brother had died before her, and then she died. And so basically my great grandfather's sister-in-law, who had one child with my great-grandfather's brother-in-law. They moved down to Grand Rapids because probably
it's the Holy Land.
Yeah, they moved to Grand Rapids, and she moved in to help with the children.
Right.
And then they married. And that woman then became the grandmother that my father grew up knowing. And so both of my father's parents, they met in Grand Rapids and went to Christian school. And I mean, the whole Dutch Reform thing in Grand Rapids.
Right.
And my grandfather was a very good student.
Right.
And so in that, if you're a very good student, you become a minister. Because that's the brightest and the best going to the ministry.
Right. Right.
And so my grandfather, my grandmother, at that day, you weren't allowed to go to seminary and be married. That would flip a little later in this century.
Right,
but
right.
So they basically graduated from seminary and were going to get married and did get married. But the wedding day, my great-grandfather died of a stroke. And so instead of the big wedding that they had planned, my grandfather and my grandfather basically sat by the bed of his dying father. And that evening, the Domini came over and they just did a little quiet, wedding ceremony. And then the next day, my grandfather and my grandmother packed up their car and moved to Wisconsin to start pastoring in a church there. And back in those days, my grandfather, he'd spend between 3 and 6 years usually in a church. They just go from church to church to church to church. And so that's how my father grew up, in those little prairie churches.
Right.
In,
were they all
Midwest.
Some variation on Dutch Reformed?
Oh, yes. Yes. Everyone.
How many variations on Dutch Reform are there in the States?
Well, the main church is the Reformeerde Kerk, which is the state church from the Netherlands. And they became the Reformed Church of America in the United States. They're the oldest Protestant denomination in North America because of the Dutch.
Yeah. And like we're talking Manhattan here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that church had a bunch of splits in the Netherlands, usually over issues involving modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And those little splinter groups in the Netherlands disproportionately contributed to American Dutch immigration, probably because they were rural and poor and, next to starving. Mm-hmm. So what was like 3 or 4% of these little splinter groups in the Netherlands became 75% of Dutch immigration.
Right.
So when they started coming over in the 19th century, the church had various names early on. Eventually, they would kind of coalesce as the Christian Reformed Church, as opposed to the Reformed Church of America.
Mm-hmm.
And they were, they kept the language longer. They kept their theological, the Heidelberg Catechism. Right. They kept that longer. They kept all of those things longer. And so the Christian Reformed Church, also partly because they were this, and then in the First World War was when they basically started using English, because everyone and other people in America thought they were German, and the anti-German waves during the First World War, you find these Christian Reformed churches just festooned with flags.
Right.
Because Deutsch is not Dutch, I swear.
Right. Well, the Americans have always been kind of confused between the Dutch and the Deutsch. And the Germans, and so I can understand that.
Like Pennsylvania Dutch. They're not Dutch. They're German.
Yeah, they should be Deutsch, but Americans they don't want to say that,
So my father, my grandfather had a church in Iowa, and my father.
So you're third generation.
Yes. So my grandfather was then going to take a church in Canada, because there was a whole wave of Dutch immigrants going to Canada after the Second World War. Mm-hmm. They went to Canada and California after the Second World War, a lot of them, because they're looking for places that they could do dairy, because that's what a lot of these people did.
That's a Dutchy thing to do.
It's a Dutchy thing to do. It's a Frisian.
That and build furniture in Grand Rapids.
Yeah, well, and in Paterson and places like that. So anyway, my father then finished up his high school education in Iowa and then went to Grand Rapids, while my grandfather and my aunt and my uncle all went up to Owen Sound, Ontario. And that was actually a church that my grandfather spent the longest amount of time in. There's a whole bunch of stories behind that too. So then my father went to Calvin College.
Right.
And I was originally interested in studying chemistry, but then, felt a call to the ministry.
Right.
And so at that point, you'd get your degree basically in classics from the college, and you'd go on to seminary, and then you would do church. And he had he was valedictorian of his class. My mother grew up in Massachusetts in the Whitensville area. And the Christian Reformed Church got its start there from the Frisians, because Whitensville was this little mill town, industrial mill town. And Mr. Whiten was one of these magnates who was like patriarch of the village and took care of all of his workers. And there was a cow influenza that came in and wiped out their dairy cows. So the town had no milk. So, of course, Mr. Whiten goes to the place in the world that has the best dairy cows and buys dairy cows from the Netherlands. And the cow workers come with the cows to Whitensville.
Right.
And that's how the Christian Reformed Church starts in Whitensville, Massachusetts.
Right. So your father ended up then in Paterson. That was one thing. People who are not connected to the Christian Reformed bodies may not know is, what is the relationship of the pastor to the congregation? That is to say,
they call him Domine, which means Lord.
Right. but they're like, for instance, in the Presbyterian Church, which is also a split off from Calvin's Reformed theology, they have the elders are very separate, and the church is very separate from the minister. And so he is basically a hired gun who comes in, and whenever he feels his time is up, or they feel his time is up, they will, shop around. Does something similar work within the Dutch Reformed traditions?
That's how it traditionally worked.
Yeah.
That the church was the church, and the pastor was hired by the church to teach them catechism.
Right. Which is very interesting, because it makes it a kind of a proto-democracy in the way that you have in America. And I think a lot of people don't understand how much the Reformed tradition goes into the building of democracy within the Northern European, Western European, American systems, the Anglo.
Oh, yes.
No. So how long had your father been here before you were born? How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I'm a middle child. I have an older sister, and I have a younger sister who's deceased.
Right.
But the Paterson angle is important because
I'm coming to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, essentially, I'm going to ask you about Paterson a bunch in a moment here, but I want to ask you about what it was like to be a PK. And could you explain what a PK and an MK are to people who may not understand this church jargon?
Well, a PK is a preacher's kid, and an MK is a missionary's kid. And an MK, oh gosh. See, I'm more MK than PK. Because
your father was more of a missionary.
Yes.
Right. So,
and in the CRC, so in many ways, I did this video on ideals.
Right.
In many ways, even though the Protestants have this whole theology that the minister is just like everyone else, but he's called.
Right.
They don't act as if that's the case.
Right.
Because the minister and his family are supposed to be an idealized version of everyone else. But there's all these subtle undercurrents that sometimes really mess with the children of preachers. And they either become sort of, carbon copies of their father or total rebels.
And I was going to ask you, what happened to you, in relationship to your father? He's the preacher. Are you the rebellious MK PK kid, or are you the carbon copy, or are you something else?
I was much more the carbon copy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But my father's church and his role in that church was just so radically different from the vast majority of Christian Reformed pastors and their families that's where the dynamics were much more missionary kid, because we were pastoring in a very different culture.
Right. But okay, so this is a good time. Tell me what Paterson, New Jersey is like, because now I spent 16 years in New York. I went to all sorts of places in New York, but I never, and New Jersey and Connecticut and the whole tri-state. Never went to Paterson. I went to like Newark, and I went to Hoboken and all sorts of other places. But I was looking at Paterson saying, did I drive through there on the way to the Delaware Water Gap or anything?
You drove through there many times.
Yes, but never stopped.
But never stopped.
Yeah.
Nor would you want to.
Well, what was Paterson like when you were a kid?
So Paterson has been an immigrant city it's always been this minor place of immigrants and industry. And it's strange because there's Alexander Hamilton met George Washington in Paterson, and they believed that Paterson was going to be the industrial center of their new nation because of the Passaic River and the waterfalls and all of that. So Paterson did have an important industrial role to play. But by the time, Paterson has just been a place where there've just been wave after wave after wave of usually poor, struggling people trying to find employment in the new land. But if they get anywhere in Paterson, they move up.
I was just reading, it's the second largest Muslim town in America.
Yeah. And the 9/11, some of the 9/11 attackers basically were living 3 blocks from the house I grew up in.
Right. But I'm imagining when you were growing up, it was a little different than that.
It was very different from that.
Yeah.
So in the 60s, so immigration, basically the spigot turns off on a lot of non-American immigration in the, by the time you get to the First World War and then into the 50s and 60s, there's not a lot of immigration into North America. So what the industrial, that's where you have the, where's the book? The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. She writes about the Great Migration. That's where you have African Americans leaving Jim Crow South, coming to the industrialized North. And so in Paterson, that was the phase when African Americans left the South and came to places like Paterson for jobs and to get away from Jim Crow. You can get a sense of it in Bob Dylan's song, The Hurricane. And actually, if you watch the movie, The Hurricane, it's so funny because the bar that Reuben Carter walks out of is actually the corner bar right by the church. Now, inside, it doesn't look anything like it's in the movies, but they filmed the outside locale, 2 doors away from the church that I grew up in.
Right.
The Paterson's pretty small too.
Right.
But it's so it was in the 60s. There was then. So when my father gets there in 1960, the Dutch CRC groups had been, they had been there for, a number of decades, and they were getting increasingly affluent, and they were moving out to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And their churches were staying behind because, that usually the people move, and then in the CRC, unlike the RCA, the churches eventually follow them out to the suburbs. But there were some, very high in openness CRC people who watched the African Americans move into Paterson and saw them struggle and saw their pain and said, shouldn't we do something for them?
Right.
And so they started a mission or a chapel. That was how the CRC did mission. They started a chapel, which was sort of inner city gospel salvation. If you want the sandwich, you gotta hear the kind of Americanish revival gospel story. And so,
Right.
and the CRCs had done that for a while.
So was Paterson kind of a ghetto at that time?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that
Or was
whole
it
area
becoming-
is ghettos.
Right.
It was a black ghetto.
Right.
You had the Italians,
Sure.
the Puerto Ricans are coming up, you can think West Side Story, and all these little ghettoized neighborhoods, and everybody knew where the lines were.
Right. Yeah, I looked at the map and there's all these little communities, with names around it, and there's Paterson, but then, you could just see it was all divided up. And I'm sure there was a section that was like really posh still. And then there were, sections those people never went to, and that sort of thing. So what was the ethnicity of your church? What kind of mixture of people?
Mostly African Americans, plus some of the Dutch CRC types that were interested in missions.
Right.
But as the 60s kept going, increasingly we'd have young, sort of rebellious CRC kids
Right.
who were interested in racial reconciliation, because the civil rights movement was, increasingly, it was going on. And
well,
so
it was on the down slant, because you have you were born in 63. That's when, Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. So you weren't conscious for that. But as your consciousness increases by the time of, say, 1970, you're starting to notice certain things. And as it goes into the 70s, now, what's happened, of course, is Martin Luther King's been assassinated. The movement's gone from being, kind of a folk protest, going to lay my burdens down by the riverside kind of thing, into, much more of a radical sort of take on things. People wearing African clothes, people talking about Black power and stuff. So that's the world you became conscious in.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that was the world I was naively conscious of. I just thought that was the world.
Right.
You're a kid.
Oh, exactly.
I remember the first time hearing on the news, because my parents were news junkies, so I became a news junkie, hearing that African Americans, Black folks, were 10% of the population of the nation. I almost hit the floor.
How old were you about then?
I was probably 8 or 9 or 10 or something.
Okay.
Because it was like, that can't be right. There's way more Black people than white people.
Look outside your door.
Let's look around.
Yeah. Well,
white people all seem to be kind of spread around, but Black people, boy, there's tons of them.
No, I had a similar experience. I spent 4 years of my childhood in Hawaii, and it was mostly Asians and Hawaiians, and then there were a few of us Howleys. And it was kind of like, I look at my one school group picture from there, and we're all wearing like barefoot, but you look and I realized, I was in the minority, and I didn't realize it. Then I got to California and everything got weird. So
well, but it was also weird for me too, because the neighborhoods were changing, the Dutch were moving out, but at that point, there was, especially as the second wave anti-racism got going, you had to live in the community you were ministering to. And so, the Dutch and the white folks were leaving,
right?
Immigrants and Black folks and Puerto Ricans. And then we started getting, just waves of other immigrants coming in, but we lived in the community, but we're Christian Reformed. So we went to school with the Christian Reformed community.
Right.
And so where I lived and who I went to church with, was the connections were really interesting between those who I went to school with. And of course, in the Christian Reformed Church, there were all kinds of struggles about, how all kinds of internal struggles about Dutchness and being Christian Reformed.
Right.
Because that was the roots of the church. But now in a place like Paterson.
Did you feel very connected to Dutchness? I mean, I know you've never been to Europe, so you've never done that. But did you feel like connected to Dutch traditions growing up?
Not really. Part of it, not anything like a lot of my contemporaries who grew up in the Christian Reformed Church.
Right. Not
who
people
grew up
from
in white
Holland,
communities,
Michigan.
or many in, rural communities.
Right.
But actually, it's funny because we're having a discussion about this on CRC Voices the other day. It's the groups in like urban, the Dutch that are in urban areas feel a need to go over the top in their Dutchness just to sort of maintain their identity, as opposed to necessarily some of the rural groups that are just out there farming and doing dairy work.
Right.
So there's with these immigrant communities over multiple generations, there's just so much nuance going on. And I would say one of the things that my upbringing really afforded me was a ton of sensitivity to cultural nuance, because I was just immersed in it.
Right.
Because African Americans were going through this entire identity struggle, and the Dutch were going through this whole identity struggle. I mean, everybody, and they're all doing it next to each other, and there's conflict, and there's politics, and there's religion.
The 70s was really the time when people started talking about Italian American, Irish American, African American. That was when a lot of that came to the fore. You don't hear so much about the variations on European ethnic Americans anymore, but you certainly, of course, hear lots about some of the primary groups of, Chinese, Japanese. You hear African American as kind of a generalized term, although there are genuine Africans like, Nigerian Americans and such.
And the Puerto Ricans and the descendants of former slaves in Carolina and the Carolinas, which is where a lot of the East Coast immigration goes, they're very different cultures.
Oh, yeah.
And they don't necessarily get along, nor do the Jamaicans. And
oh, yeah. Well, I used to live on I had lots of connections with Puerto Ricans in New York, but I also lived for several years on a Dominican street. And so we'll talk about that when we get to the Dominican islands. But those are radically different cultures in many ways. The music was different, the food was different, the way they looked was different. And what was it like for you in high school? Because that's a time when a lot of people are forming someone once said, in America, you are who you are for the rest of your life in high school. And it's not so much who you are when you go in, it's kind of who you are by the time you get out. Yeah. That there's a way in which we define our identities that way.
Yeah, I was a nerd for one thing. I was physiologically a very late bloomer, because even though I'm big and tall, I mean, people, when I sent in a picture for a high school reunion, people didn't recognize me. Right. I looked very different as a high school senior than I looked even 3 years into college.
Sure.
So, so part of it was, I lived and worshiped in a black, and then, we had Yugoslav neighbors for a while, and they were Muslim.
Right. And
I remember when the little boy I played with went in for circumcision, and it's like, what's going on here? His sister was like, he can't come out and play because he's hurting. Well, why is he hurting? Because they cut something off his penis. It's like, they used to, right. Paterson was just, and also you have to remember too, that heroin went through.
Sure.
When I was just coming up into consciousness. And so and Paterson was getting burned out because landlords could get more money from insurance.
Yeah. So it was dealing with South Bronx.
Right. And that was Paterson too. So the two houses next to us were condemned for a while. There was a crazy street preacher who made a church out of the downstairs, but he was psychological. I mean, the stories, a lot of them are in my father's book. The best ones aren't because he couldn't tell them. But the kind of insanity and chaos I grew up in, next to, not in, because the family, the Dutch CRC, my mother, they kept order.
Right.
And so there was chaos all around me. And even now, with the homeless people and all kinds of stuff around.
I see a continuity here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Tell me about
the drug addicts. I mean, I grew up with drug addicts.
Well,
and tell
me also about your trips to New York when you were younger, you know, and you first started to see, because New York during that time was going through its apocalyptic phase. I think they may be going through that again, but you know, it's like I remember watching Taxi Driver and then getting to New York, and that's what it was, because I arrived there in 1980, a few years later, and I saw, you know, there's this guy with greasy hair playing the drums. I saw that guy on the streets. There was, you know, I saw the 8th Avenue was just like the most nightmarish prostitution porn zone imaginable. And eventually they would clean it up and stick, Disney theaters on 42nd Street and all of that. But what was it like for you being exposed to that kind of pow in your head, you know, just because it's pretty intense?
So my grandparents, when they left Owen Sound, Ontario, they moved to West Sayville, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
And hang on a second, someone's trying to get me here. So just
okay.
I want to pause.
We'll just leave it for a moment. Oh, it's probably got some homeless person trying to get in. And he tells all these stories about people who come up to his door and do all sorts of radical things. Sometimes they're helpful, and other times they're just a lot of craziness. Or this just could be a parishioner. We don't know. I'm just.
Okay. I'll let them know. Yeah. Okay, sir. Thank you. Yep. So my grandparents moved from Owen Sound, Ontario to West Sayville, New York. And my grandmother, my father's mother, loves New York City. This is the early 60s.
Right.
The World's Fair. And my grandmother actually has a woman's column in the Banner, which is the weekly magazine of the Christian Reformed Church.
Right.
And so my grandmother loves the city. And so I grow up, we went into the city, and my father loved New York City. We'd go to Rockefeller Center. We'd go to Riverside Church. We'd go up to the top of the Empire State Building. And then finally, when the World Trade Center was built, we'd go up there. But then my father would also have to go into the city for various things. Like there's this toy donation thing. And so I'd often go and drive with my father into the city. And so that was sort of the young years, but you're exactly right. As the 60s and the 70s moved on, you went into the A-beam years, bankruptcy. So by the time I was in high school, CRC kids were sneaking into the city, you know, for porn, basically. And it was sort of Tour the Apocalypse.
This isn't your click a couple of buttons and you're in a website. This is like, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. This was, Heart of Darkness kind of stuff.
That's right. And that's Times Square.
Right. Exactly.
And so I graduated high school in 81. And so I would, by that point I was already kind of a geek. Right. I got to watch those terms with you because you really know them, but I was a nerd. And so I would go into New York City basically to go to the bookstores. I didn't go for the porn. I went for the bookstores. And, you could, from Paterson, it was so easy to get into the city. Right. You could take the path, the Port Authority, go right under the river, come up in the World Trade Center and, go. And so I'd go to the bookstores, or I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with my other nerdy friends. And, I was into like Avalon Hill games, strategy games.
Right.
And so you'd find, you'd have good sources for those kinds of things in New York City because you can get anything in New York City.
Did you ever go into the big J&R Music World downtown?
No, I wasn't super into music.
For 4 years, 80 to 84, I worked there. So.
No, I never went. So New York was a place where, it was just everything intensified, but it was grimy and dark. I'll tell. So after I left, so then I went back into the city I met so I meet my wife and bringing my wife back to New Jersey to see where I grew up with yada, 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 which she's my fiance at that point. And so and she's like, I want to see New York City. I said, okay, what do you want to see? I want to see everything. It's like, you can't see everything. And she's like, no, you're just not wanting to. So I finally said, okay, give me the list of priorities. What do you want to see first? Statue of Liberty. Okay. Do you want to go up into it? Oh, definitely. Okay. And of course I knew, right. I didn't tell her. There's the day.
Exactly. Yeah. I did that once. And that was it.
That's right. And so then I gave her a little tour driving around Manhattan a little bit, but driving in New York has always been a crazy thing. So, right. And unfortunately, at least for some, I was in LA just recently and traffic got a little gnarly and my wife looked at me and because she knew what mode I was going to go into and right. She's like, don't do it. It's like, I gotta. And so then you drive like my father drove in Paterson in New York. And
yeah, well, that's what I have to do to drive here in Tbilisi, Georgia, is I pull out my New York card versus their Tbilisi card. The Tbilisi card is like super sneaky and it's just chaos. And a car will just keep edging towards you. And if you have any brinksmanship, they win. So it's just like when I play the New York card, it's just like, don't even think about it. And I just keep going. It's just like, you're going to stop. Don't worry. Yeah. So tell me, just summing up the New Jersey part of your life here, tell me, what do you think stuck with you and informed your outlook on life from New Jersey? What kinds of things from your growing up era really kind of formed who you are? I mean, we talked about kind of like dealing with outcasts and you've got the same people living on your doorstep sometimes in Sacramento. But how do you see that?
I think both a real hyper consciousness about cultural differences and a comfort with it. But I think probably what stuck in me most deeply was my father's sacrificial giving for others, because he really did just simply pour himself out for those people. And that was, I think about him now, and unfortunately he died. Who would have been wonderful to have on the channel. He would have loved this whole YouTube business. He'd be all over it. But I'd love to ask him if he ever saw a black man growing up apart from maybe a Pullman porter, because he grew up in the most rural,
white bread.
Yeah. Pella, Iowa, Lighton,
well, you kind of make you wonder why he chose to do what he did.
Well, this is that little piece of the story.
Right.
So when he finished seminary, he had two calls, one to Northern Alberta, interestingly enough, and the other to take this little gospel mission. And at that point, the duchies were, how long can we just kind of keep this thing going? It really needs to be its own church.
Right.
And that was only 4 hours away from my mother's family in Massachusetts. And so my father had done a seminary internship there, and, he was going to marry my mother, and my mother's kind of like, I don't want to live in Northern Alberta.
Yes, trust me.
So they settle in Paterson, New Jersey, which is only 4 hours away from Whitensville. And that became another big part of my growing up years, because, I've got racial reconciliation, I've got drug culture, I've got constant immigration, I've got tons of chaos. But then Whitensville was small town America.
Right. Your mother is Dutch too?
She's Frisian.
Frisian. Okay. Well, some Dutch people don't consider them Dutch. I know enough about the culture to know the Frisians are always like the weirdos up there in the north kind of thing.
So she's Frisian. She's pure Frisian.
Right. So then did you then go to Calvin College?
So it was very unusual. So this is why I'm not a traditional PK. My father was, because they moved every 3 to 5 years.
Right.
And preachers' kids in the CRC often had sort of a rootless existence, sort of like MK's. But my father spent 36 years in Paterson,
right,
which was very unusual in the Christian Reformed Church.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had my whole growing up period all in one place. And then, you know, again, I wasn't the rebel. What you do when you graduate from Eastern Christian is you go to Calvin College. And for me, it's like, why would I look for a college? That's just the place you go.
Explain to people who don't understand what Calvin College is in relationship to Dutch America, what Calvin College is.
Calvin College is owned by the Christian Reformed Church, unlike Dordt and some of the other colleges sort of in its orbit, because Calvin College was started first because Dutch immigrants needed ministers for their Christian Reformed churches. So it was a denominational seminary, but also, so then the college used to be a prep school just for the seminary. But then the next mandate the college had was the Christian Reformed Church needed teachers to teach their Christian day schools all over the country. Because if you're a Christian Reformed, you first started the church, but then as soon as you can, you start the day school. And so Calvin College started with those missions. But over time, that continued to expand. But then in terms of Christian Reformed history, the Second World War was vitally important because after the Second World War, these people who had grown up sort of in this Dutch Reformed womb got exposed to a much bigger world. You had now post-war emigration from the Netherlands that were bringing a lot more Kuyperian influence. And so that sort of led to this renaissance in the Christian Reformed Church
what had happened
parallels Christianity today.
So what had happened with Abraham Kuyper near the beginning of the 20th century in the Netherlands took until after World War II to really reach the shores of America.
Yes. And when it did, it hit hard because so these soldiers that were part of the Second World War now had this huge world that they somehow had to integrate.
Right.
But they were also deeply, deeply Dutch Calvinist. And that's where you get, the generation that then taught Nicholas Waltersdorf, Alvin Plantinga, and Richard Mouw.
Were these people still there when you were going there?
They were just almost out the door. I wasn't able to get a class with Alvin Plantinga. I did get Richard Mouw, and I did get Nick Waltersdorf. Right.
Yeah, I actually, I think, shook Alvin Plantinga's hand once before I knew who he was, because I was working in Glacier National Park in Montana. And there is a connection between places like Michigan and Glacier National Park. So I was really good friends with his daughter. And it was just like a weird last name to me. But and then one day he came and I said hello to him, and it was just, and then later I've got books by him and going, wait a minute. And I was already a Christian, but it was interesting coming from the Jesus people dealing with these obviously Christian Reformed, Dutch Christian Reformed youngsters in Alaska. It was like, I kind of connected to them. And on another level, they were definitely in a different Christian orbit. And I remember talking to his daughter once, and this was before I'd gone to L'Abri. And I said, so, what do you think is the biggest problem of literature and of American literature and stuff? And she just looked at me very carefully and just simply said, irony. And I was like, I didn't understand what that meant. Years later, it was just like, this girl was like way beyond me, and she was younger than me, and I had no idea. Now I would be like, if I was like talking to myself now, if I could put myself back in and go like, Burn, talk to her some more, talk to those two weird Dutch Michigan girls more. But anyway, that's another story. So what did you take there? What kind of classes? What were you interested in?
History. Well, I was unsure what I wanted to do. So I started with engineering because I didn't know what engineering was, but I liked math. And so started with engineering. And then I did math. I did a lot of math.
Mm-hmm.
And then I hit a point in math where there's this guy who lived in my dorm who today we'd say he's on the spectrum.
Right.
And everybody knew. First, I thought this dude is the disabled sibling of someone who's coming in for school. And then all the parents and siblings left and he was still there. And then I wound up finally in advanced math with this guy. And he knew everything that was going on. And I felt lost. So I thought, no, math isn't for me. So then I went into history. And then eventually from history into took more Greek and philosophy and speech and stuff because I was going to go to seminary.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So at a certain point, where did you go to seminary?
I was going to go to Fuller because, see, my rebellion is odd.
Yeah.
So on one hand,
I'm getting it. Yeah, Fuller. Yeah, I see what you're saying. A lot of people who are listening to this aren't going to get that, but no. I do.
so on one hand, I was so much like my father, but I'm also a lot like my mother. And that's a strange combination because she's just pragmatic, stoic, Frisian. And he was sort of intellectual. My mother was plenty intellectual too, but, you know, and so I was in a lot of ways, I knew I did not want to be a minister, but theology and ministry, all that stuff just came so easily. And I really enjoyed it.
Right.
So then I thought I'd be a missionary because that, you know, and again, looking back on myself, it's like, oh, this all makes perfect sense. But when you're in the midst of it and you're a teenager in your early 20s, what do you know?
Right.
And so I was going to go to Fuller because that was the hot place to go then at that point. You know, some of my cool classmates were heading out to Fuller for a year or two. And I thought, I'm just going to go to Fuller because I'm not planning on being a Christian Reformed minister. I don't know what I'm going to do. I just want to study more theology and philosophy and have those kind of and enjoy churches. Right. So I'm just going to go to Fuller and then we'll see what happens next. But I had fallen in love with a girl at Calvin and the Christian Reformed Church. What
is this the
minister
same girl
from our
that
classes? What's that?
This girl that you fell in love with, is this the same that you married?
Yeah. Yep.
So she was a Calvin student as well.
She was a Calvin student as well, but not with CRC background.
Okay.
She was actually a missionary's kid.
Uh-huh.
Her parents were missionaries in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm. Was she Dutch?
Until her father had malaria so bad,
right?
They moved to Eastern Michigan, and he was a Lutheran pastor.
Uh-huh.
But her mother was a dyed-in-the-wool fundamentalist Baptist of Dutch genetics. So so anyway. But then also the Christian Reformed Church is like, you know, if you go to Calvin Seminary, we'll pretty much pay for the whole thing. It's kind of like Fuller was expensive. So then I went to Calvin Seminary. The pastor from Classis Hackensack says to me, he says, you know, we're always giving classical aid to these people who have almost no relationship to our classes. It would be wonderful to actually support someone who really, really is one of us.
Right. So what years were you there from and to?
So I had to take 5 years at Calvin College because I had to get all my Greek in before seminary. And I didn't start doing that until my senior year.
Uh-huh.
But I loved it. I loved Calvin College. Right. That was just fun. So I spent the whole 80s on campus in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Right.
And then I wound up spending, you know, it should have taken me, I wound up spending extra time at Calvin Seminary because I started taking the full load. And my then girlfriend, Calvin Seminary at that point was they just worked their students just to death. It was just an insane workload. The accrediting basically pulled them off it a few years after I left. But my girlfriend basically said to me, you know, if you keep up this schedule, I'm going to break up with you because I never see you anyway. So then I kind of eased off the pedal a little at Calvin Seminary, which I really liked because I could learn something.
Do I detect a pattern that kind of went through your marriage there?
Well, yeah. And so
yeah.
Marriage is a whole nother thing that I'm not going to talk about.
Yeah, I figured I won't pry too far into that. But what was Calvin College culture like? I would occasionally meet Calvin College students when I visited L'Abri, because there was a small pipeline that occasionally they came there, especially in the 80s when it seemed like L'Abri was at its lowest moment, and most of the students, there's a whole bunch coming from Calvin College, and they all seem to be like, but I don't understand about predestination. You know, and it was just like, and the L'Abri people were like, can we talk about something else?
Calvin College. So the one thing to understand about the Christian Reformed Church is, in many ways, for much of its history into the 60s and 70s, was a genetically tied extended family.
Right.
And these were your people. You know, they could be heretics. They could do all kinds of things. So they were still your cousins, because they were literally your cousins.
Right.
And so what developed at Calvin, and what a lot of people who just look at Calvin College don't understand about it, is that at that point, especially, something like 70 to 80% of your students are sort of pragmatic, conservative people who are getting on with life. And you have, at the same time, sort of a much more progressivist intellectual who is sort of enjoying pushing back a little bit on deep Christian Reformed conservatism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so what's been happening since the 70s and 80s, and it's sort of parallel to, you know, again, the neo-evangelicals that Molly Worthen talks about, the Christian Reformed Church has just basically been in a long process of assimilation, stuck between the tensions of the mainline and the evangelicals. And all of this sort of weird Dutchness with each passing generation is sort of dissolving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you're seeing them in the 80s, you're still seeing some of that Dutch Reform genetic still working its way out.
Right.
But for example, now less than half of Calvin College students grew up in the Christian Reformed Church. Mm-hmm. And it's increasingly becoming a place where some evangelicals want to send their kids because it's a good education. But Calvin is deeply torn by this rift in the culture.
Is it becoming more secular?
So the fact that Jesus and John Wayne was written by a Calvin prof, and the impact that that book has had in the evangelical wars since, is a tell.
Right.
So, you know, so part of what may very well be happening in the next 10 years is that the Christian Reformed Church, like the Reformed Church in America, basically fractures in multiple pieces. Mm-hmm. Calvin College is going to be a really interesting thing to watch, because it is actually owned by the denomination. Right. Whereas other schools like Dort can sort of, with their board of trustees, sort of go off and differentiate in their own way. Right. But the bloodbath in Grand Rapids over the same-sex marriage fight is going to be horrendous.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you know, you look at many of the oldest universities in America, like Princeton and Harvard and Yale, they were all started as Christian. Yeah. And then eventually what happens is, you know, that aspect falls aside, and what's left is just education with a, you know, divinity school or something like that. Yeah. And
the best person to read on that is George Marsden, who was one of my professors of history at Calvin, because he's sort of become preeminent scholar on American fundamentalism. And he also has, now I just noticed, a revised edition of his book of the story of what happened basically to the American University.
What's the name of that book? Do you remember?
See, the new edition, because I had the old edition in paper, and the new edition just came out, and it was the last book I bought. The new title, the old edition was The Soul of the American University. The new edition is The Soul of the American University Revisited from Protestant to Post-Secular. Right. So, and that's just out May 2021. So George is getting up there in age, but he's still working.
So, like New Jersey, what would you say if you were to take something away from your Calvin College time? What kinds of things, you know, stick with you one way or another?
I think what I gained at, so if from New Jersey, if I sort of got a heart for the invisible people, at Calvin, I sort of got a heart for trying to hold two things that are pushing against each other in tension.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the same-sex marriage thing for me is just torturous, because on one hand, part of me is with I grew up as a card-carrying Christian Reformed progressive.
Right.
I mean, that is who I was at Calvin was one of the really odd students who, would vote for Democrats. And I wasn't in love with Reagan. I, in fact, went with a bunch of my professors and protested Ronald Reagan at the Gerald R. Ford Museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Right.
And I went to Nicaragua to tour the revolution.
Right.
And all of that for me, legitimately grew up out of the civil rights movement, my experience in Paterson. So I was very much that way. But part of what Calvin always tried to do was, on one hand, and this is some of the Kuyperian influence, was try and look at the seriousness of the issues of modernity, while also trying to hold a historic practice and love of Christianity.
Right.
And so Calvin was in many ways trying to hold that tension. It was one of the Christian colleges where you would get an education in evolution, while at the same time Heidelberg Catechism.
Right.
And they tried to keep those things together. And so that's
which I think is a noble
Calvin.
goal.
That's me.
Yeah.
What's that?
And I think it's a noble goal to try to. Because one thing I've noticed from the Dutch tradition is that they take science seriously. They take art seriously. They take your reason and rationality, history, philosophy, all very seriously. And the best of them take their Bible seriously as well. Historically, giving room for, interpretation and, the things we can't know. But, it's and a lot of denominations swing wildly one side to the other. So was it straight out of seminary that you decided to go to the Dominican Republic, or was there a pause there, or how did that work?
My wife, so since she grew up as a foreign missionaries kid, she always wanted to do missions, foreign missions. And she had a degree in education and Spanish from the college. And so she wanted to go to a Spanish-speaking country. We almost went to Brazil, but the guy I was supposed to do my internship with was called up to teach at Calvin Seminary at that point. And so we wound up in the Dominican Republic working with Haitians. And so, here I find myself again working with a beleaguered minority in a country, only now it's much more rural. Right. Because the Haitians are out there picking, coughing, and cutting sugarcane. You
said Haiti.
I was in the Dominican Republic near the Haitian border.
I see.
Working with Haitians.
So you were meeting with both groups of people then.
I was living. It's so strange. I look back on it now. I was living with Dominicans because we're living in the Dominican Republic, but I was working with Haitians.
I see. So that must have been. Shall we say, a cold glass of water? What was that like for you culturally? You must have hit moments of culture shock where you just said, like, what am I doing here? Or because that is radically different from even Paterson, New Jersey, Well,
one of my first shocks was realizing that, I remember in seminary, a guy named Viv Grigg, who had a mission agency, Servants Among the Poor, was doing a book tour at that point. And this was a guy who went total indigenous. I mean, he lived in the slums in the Philippines, and he did. And of course, growing up when and where I did with the parents I did, that seemed to me the most credible Christ-like approach to missions. Right. And then going to the Dominican Republic, also it turned out as we were getting ready to go to the Dominican Republic, my wife is pregnant. unplanned.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, where were your children born?
So then I'm doing my internship, and in my first year in the Dominican Republic, we moved 13 times. Yeah, we lived with a Dominican family for a while. I mean, it was again, looking back on it, it was a little chaotic, but again, you have to understand, in some aspects of my life, I have a really high tolerance for chaos, but that's sometimes compensated in other aspects of my life where I just dig into a routine.
Right.
And it makes for, a really weird person. But so one of the early shocks in the Dominican Republic. So we moved down there, and we were living in sort of a guest house, which
what year
the
was
mission. It's in the Dominican Republic, Santo Domingo.
What year?
This was 1990.
Okay, that's what I figured. So you were there about 6 or 7 years?
I was there until 97.
Yeah.
Yep. So I remember we moved into this guest house, and, I'm in language training, and my wife is pregnant, and we're living in this house. And one of the things, so we're living in this house in a fairly nice part of town. And, there's high walls and bars because crime is always an issue. And the woman who takes care of the house is, of course, of darker skin. And now it's like, where I grew up, and the cultural liturgies around racial reconciliation that I grew up is all these white folks with black, house help. And I'm just like, how am I going to navigate all these new cultural filters? Mm-hmm. But in the Dominican Republic, well, for Pete's sake, you don't have, living in the third world actually takes a lot more effort, because electricity's on and off, water's on and off. To keep the house clean in a city without any emissions, everything just covers with soot. So, and you're enormously wealthy compared to these people. So what's wrong with you not giving them a job? Because that's how they look at you. You come to this country and you must be fabulously wealthy. You ought to be employing just as many people as you can. Don't be cooking your own meals. Don't be mopping your own floors. Pay someone to do it. What kind of miser are you? And that, that's a total reversal of all kinds of things I grew up. So I got to get my head around that. And, and then I start working with Haitians, and, that's a completely different culture. And there's always this thing about, there's always tensions between the culture next door. So Dominicans and Haitians, a lot of tensions between them, even though they're like this. Dominicans and Puerto Ricans, a lot of tensions like that. You see all kinds of Puerto Ricans working with Haitians, but Dominicans and Puerto Ricans don't get along. You're just watching all of this stuff. And of course, the Haitians are, Haiti is in some ways a little bit of Africa in the Western Hemisphere.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, and the, I think looking back on it emotionally, I found a lot of those kinds of tensions in me just simply crushing emotionally, because
did that contribute to your reasons eventually to leave?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Because you very quickly realize that, and probably something my father realized, but never said out loud, no matter what I do with these people, for these people, it's just going to be grim. It really is. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the strategies of, let's say, a lot of what happens in these countries is you find somebody with a lot of potential. And so you pour a lot into them, and then they sort of, it's sort of like injecting them with Western, wealthy, materialistic, weird testosterone. Right. And you make the kind of, you think this person's really going to serve their community. And what they wind up doing is working for a multinational.
Right.
So it's just you just had a real.
You're giving them potential. And then suddenly they take it and run away with it.
And of course.
Yeah. Well, it's like the old Lou Rawls song, Dead End Street, or there's another version of it, Tobacco Road, where it was just like the person leaves their impoverished place. Dead End Street was leaving impoverished Chicago, and the guy singing, "One day I'm going to go back." He never does in the song.
No, and you'll never fit in again.
No.
So we had two and then one on the way in the Dominican Republic when we finally left.
Mm-hmm.
And then spent some time in North America. I didn't know what I was going to do when I got back.
Right. Where did you go? To New Jersey?
Back to Grand Rapids.
Grand Rapids.
So we stayed so I had a good church home in Grand Rapids, Madison Square CRC, which
Mm-hmm.
was in many ways like my father's church in
Mm-hmm.
some ways, but Christian Reformed churches in Grand Rapids are very different from Christian Reformed churches away from Grand Rapids.
Right.
In that there's so much population and culture there. The
Right.
dynamics are different. So we went back to Grand Rapids, and my wife had lived from age 13 on through college in Grand Rapids, in suburban Grand Rapids. So her mother was there, and, I could pretty easily get a job. So I was actually teaching computers, working for a recovery outfit that had to train a whole bunch of therapists to start using PCs. And
Right.
in the Dominican Republic, I learned pretty quickly. I enjoy technology and this bunch of things. So I was doing that for a while, and then eventually got to the point where I said, I had 3 children at that point, and just doing that kind of work wasn't gonna, really put food on the table long term.
Right.
And so I thought about, well, maybe I could pastor a local church.
Mm-hmm. And then
I had two job offers, one in Chicago and one here in Sacramento. And frankly, this church looked the most dysfunctional and the most like the church I grew up in.
Right.
And so I took it. And after being here not too very long, I discovered, wow, I really love this work.
Right.
And then it triggers, I'm just like my father. And quickly I'm doing these things, and it's like I'm living my father's life.
So did you show up in Sacramento in 97?
Yeah.
And what was the difference? How would you say the difference between Sacramento then versus Sacramento now?
I don't think Sacramento has changed a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's just continued to grow more so.
Mm-hmm.
Sacramento's kind of a weird town because people don't understand California very well from the outside.
Right,
I mean, it's such a complex state. And California, because it's the state capital, very early on, they had very progressive, hiring practices. So African Americans could get good jobs in Sacramento. And when redlining ended, the neighborhood I lived in was like one of the first really nice suburban neighborhoods that African Americans could, get out into and live a suburban life.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the 80s, cities in California often grow like trees. They just keep expanding out until they hit some boundary. And so Sacramento has just kept doing that since I've been here. But the racial dynamics, the urban dynamics are quite different from East Coast ghettos. And even and Michigan race relations was very different from New Jersey race relations. In a lot of ways, Michigan was even worse because there was a lot going on. Right. But it was smoother in California.
Well, you've often described your church, Living Stones, as saying, like, you want reality, come here. It's like people, because they see you through this. So they just see Paul in his study. Paul's talking about John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson. Paul's doing these estuary things. And then when they come and visit you, they see, I can pretty much guess exactly what they're going to see. You're going to have some older folks there, and you're going to have some people you just like, what are they doing here? It's just going to be a kind of a odds and ends, what we used to say as a church is a hospital for sinners, and here's the hospital, and
this is almost hospice for sinners here at Living Stones.
Well, especially if your church is aging, is your church an aging church there?
Oh yeah. And COVID has just, it just hammered the accelerator on that.
Right. So. Do you sometimes, now, I know what kind of sermons you give because you put the the sermons online. And how does your congregation take them? How are you received within?
My congregation likes me, or they wouldn't still have me.
Right.
And I think they generally like the preaching.
There,
they really like Sunday school.
You've been going on, what is it, almost 25 years or so there?
Yeah.
That's quite a while for a pastor to be someplace.
Yeah.
So.
But they, not a lot of discussion about my sermons. Usually I get a lot more input from my visitors than I do from, because the visitors are like, my use of PowerPoint, which that they're like, and then the kinds of things I talk about.
Right.
The visitors are often kind of like, what was that? My people are used to it because they've had it for 25 years.
Sure. Yeah, no, I would love to go to a church where you were preaching, and see, your church sounds a bit like my funky Alaskan church, minus the, that is to say, we never had anyone who would preach on the kind of things you preach on. And I feel like there was a that was always the missing element in my Alaskan church experiences was, wild swings between, the kind of guy who's into preaching every week, but never really does the pastoral part, or another guy who's just, his theology was just like, please stop. But he was there with, to greet you when you moved into the town, and was very friendly. And one day came by with a whole deer he had shot, complete with the skin and the horns on it, saying, here you go, share this with your friends. And I was like, thanks. And now I have to go back and listen to you talking about success theology. All right. Yeah. He eventually left. But so why did you, did you do any experiments in your educational, like your Sunday school, church school kind of stuff in Sacramento prior to, say, YouTube? Oh yeah, I've always been. I figured you were. I'm always experimenting. Did you get that from your father? Is that your own? Yeah. My father, looking back, my father, he was always playing with things too. But the difference, so my father is really an idealist, also an intellectual, but also deeply. So my grandfather was a really boring preacher, but a really loving, caring person. And so people would tolerate the sermons, but love him for the care. My father, come from his mother, because my grandmother was quite a bit more intellectual. My father kind of had both of those things, but what I get from my mother is a pragmatism. So that's where I'm always, because so long time, I was playing with this. I mean, can we actually get this church to? What I didn't realize is that if you really want the church to grow, you find a certain shtick in the culture and you beat it to death. Yeah. And I don't have the patience for that. No. Which is fine. Well, I find it interesting, your recent forays into trying to understand what happened with these mega churches and, these emergent churches and such, because I think that's a fascinating thing. I missed most of that by being up in Alaska for 22 years. And so for me, I was just dealing with little humdrum, old school Presbyterian church, where the most exciting thing that happened was they became part of the eco thing, which, as they separated from the main Presbyterian body because of all the issues related to same-sex marriage, et cetera, et cetera. But but in a way, I think your strength is in the fact that you're both intellectually minded, but then it's kind of like, one could imagine you just going outside and having to hammer something together to make it work for church the next week. It's a combination. I got to fix a toilet today anyway. Yeah. So obviously, I mean, one of the things everyone talks to you about is Jordan Peterson, because that's essentially that's not what created the channel. Did you start the channel to do the Freddie and Paul things, or was it going before? I started the channel because sometimes some of my people would miss church. Right. And so I was just playing around with how can I record church. And then Freddie came along and said, you and me should do a TV show. And I'm thinking, I'm not going down to public access, Freddie. Right. So I said, here, when we go out for lunch, I'll take my phone
and we'll record a little. And plus, I find, Freddie's a friend, and he's interesting. He's very interesting.
Yeah, I can.
He can drive you crazy too, but he wanted to do this, and so it's like, well, let's do this. And then, of course, to
me, it is so funny that so much of this comes out of that. Because if anyone's watching your channel and they're dealing with Paul, dealing with all these kind of weighty subjects from a theological or philosophical or sociological perspective, and then go over to the Freddie and Paul videos, and they're going like, okay, this guy is rapping about some sports team or something. It's like, and sometimes his mom will be sitting there. It's just like, but I look at that and I go like, yeah, I get it. I get it. It's really funny. But before you hit on Peterson, obviously there have been different people you've done deep dives on, like Tim Keller, obviously C.S. Lewis. What are there any other people like that?
N.T. Wright.
N.T. Wright. Anybody else that? I mean, who are some of your intellectual influences? Starting back in the day, as they say.
Oh wow. Well, C.S. Lewis, I think, has been constant because my father was a lover of C.S. Lewis and read us the Narnia Chronicles when we were kids.
Right. And yet, you'd never read Discarded Image before we started talking.
No, I was like,
what? You probably, and I would bet you still haven't read Experiment in Criticism.
No, I haven't.
And you should. That would be like next one. Just like, what are you doing? It's a short book. Read it. You'll walk away with your head exploding. But anyway.
so a lot of it, I don't, so part of my issue is that I am dyslexic.
Right.
And so visually reading, I look at some people who they simply devour books quickly.
Right.
And I can't do that.
Yeah.
So physical books take time. Yeah. I remember working through, Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards. Right. A slug of a book. It was worthwhile, but it takes time.
Well, I'm not a particularly fast reader, even though I have tons of books and have read tons. And people sometimes ask me, they've seen me read and going like, Vern, you're kind of slow. And how do you do all this? I said, I just don't stop.
So when technology began to afford audiobooks,
right,
and recorded sermons,
mm-hmm.
that for me was a happy day.
Yeah.
So Lewis, and I don't know. I really enjoyed in seminary. I really enjoyed Robert Alter, getting into literary criticism of the Bible. Mm-hmm. I loved my biblical studies classes were some of my favorite classes in seminary. I loved it more than really my systematics, although we had Alvin's youngest brother, Neil, as mm-hmm. as my systematics prof at Calvin. And right. The dude's just brilliant. And his lectures were, I'd never in any of my years had lectures like Neil Planiga. I just, mm-hmm. if you, that was a feast of a lifetime to have lectures by Neil Planiga. It was astounding.
So you start YouTube, and then comes the point at which, how did you discover Jordan Peterson? What was the impetus? I mean, there's other things where you talk about the Jordan Peterson phenomenon more, and we won't do that since that can be found quite a bit. But how did you what really put it on the radar for you to make you say, like, I want to start listening to this?
Well, I think so, partly because I'm ADHD and partly because I started blogging. I started playing around with the internet in 2000 or so. I started blogging in the early aughts, and then I started reading, RSS feeds. I started cultivating RSS feeds so I could read a lot of news, because that's really important for finding sermon illustrations and feeding me that way. And then, of course, I came across Andrew Sullivan mm-hmm. and was really into the Daily Dish. Mm-hmm. And then I found Rod Dreher. Mm-hmm. And
was this pre-Benedict option?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, part of what drove me there was of course I'd been, racial reconciliation. I'd been doing all of those things.
Right.
And then of course the human sexuality stuff was in the same-sex marriage. And I began listening. This was in the early teens. I began listening to people who were, basically my other co-liberals in the denomination. And I knew my Heidelberg Catechism and Reformed theology quite well. And I began listening to them and I thought, I'm hearing something different. Something new has really sort of taking over in this.
Right.
And then I start reading Dreer, and, I always thought, well, he's kind of a reactionary. But then a couple of his posts, I thought, oh, there's at the same time, a deep desire to live out the gospel. But this is very different from the deep desire to live out the gospel that I saw in Paterson, let's say.
Right.
And I think it was one of Dreer's posts that Jordan Peterson came up. And then it was, why would a professor of psychology, because I knew enough about the background, professor of psychology in University of Toronto complain about pronouns? Because at that point, already in California, I'd been watching this pronoun trend happen often amongst my kids in, public school. And so I'm just watching all this stuff happening. And it's like, this isn't Martin Luther King Jr. I'd read a ton of Martin Luther King Jr. This is not that. What is this and where is this going? And then I began to then ask myself, well, what if I were to categorize the religion beneath what I see happening in the culture? What can I outline that? And so then, of course, and I had started playing around with YouTube partly because people had always said, oh, write a book, do some writing, write a book.
Right.
And I'm way too ADHD to get a lot done. So then I thought, nobody in my church is going to read books anymore anyway. So why don't I play around with video? And so that all kind of sort of came together.
Right. Have you, speaking of racial reconciliation and all of that, have you seen the documentary, What Killed Michael Brown?
No, I haven't.
I highly recommend it. It's by Shelby Steele. Yeah. And it's came out about a year or so ago. And it breaks down the whole Ferguson situation in St. Louis area. And it was the whole thing that started. It was the Trayvon Martin thing that started BLM, but this was the big thing that blew it up. But it's really instructive as to how we got here. I quote quite a bit of it in my 6-hour epic. I finally beat you. My 6-hour epic on how we got here, the teens. And I say I have one left to do on 2020 and I'm done. And but no, it's I think you would get a lot out of that, because he comes to a point at the end where he's saying, like, a lot of this goes back to this weird kind of, it is a kind of racism of the upper middle class liberals, of the upper class and upper middle class liberals, who are so afraid of being considered racist that they do these outrageous things. Like, for instance, he points out, he says, like, where did the projects come from? These weren't a product of the Black community. These weren't a product of, white racists with guns down in the South. These were a product of people with a lot of intelligence and a lot of money who thought they were doing good, and he basically looks at, anyway, What Killed Michael Brown? Check it out sometime. But yeah.
Recently in Sacramento, we had a shooting of a young African-American man by a couple of cops. Now, nobody mentions that neither of those cops were white that shot here in Sacramento, because this is California.
Right.
And just recently on the news, there is a story of a home invasion, a sexual assault, a murder, arson in one of the toniest areas of Sacramento. A white woman killed by a black man. But I'm watching the news treatment of this, and it's like, we went through this enormous thing with George Floyd,
Right.
and Jim Crow, all of this. And now we have this situation going on right here, which, and suddenly the whole system, I mean, Land Park is up in arms over this. And I'm watching it and I'm just thinking, my issue with so much of what I saw coming out of that third wave anti-racism was, I just don't believe you people. I simply do not believe that you actually have the welfare of African Americans at heart. I really don't believe it, because here's a situation that should just go right into your narrative and say, this man, but no, they're railroading that dude. And whether he did it or not, I don't know, but it's, I've lived and worked in African American communities and people of color communities, if you want to use that word, all my life. And I listen to it and I watch all of this stuff, and I just think, I don't believe you actually care about the kinds of people I live with and work with and worship with at all. This isn't about them. This is about a cloak of self-righteousness that you want to put on. And
well, you know, to me, it was summed up. I had a troupe of 5 actors come up to Alaska once. There were people from different stations. One guy was Armenian. There was a black guy there. There was a guy from Alaska who was there. He was my friend that brought them up there. And then there was this couple who are definitely East Coast elite types. They came over to my house and we were talking because, you know, I know about puppets and stuff. So, you know, I'm the guy to talk to if you come into the town and want an interesting conversation about theater or whatever. So they come to my house, and for some reason we got onto talking about minstrel music, which I know a lot of the history of. I made a very long video on the subject, and I'm showing them like Al Jolson in blackface. I have the oldest videos of this stuff, and I'm telling them, I'm interpreting, this is what this is about and stuff. And what's interesting is I could see the couple from the East Coast. They were just like, it was like someone was just winding them up, and they were like getting stiffer and stiffer. And the black guy says to me, this is really fascinating. I wish more people would talk about this stuff. And that to me said exactly, you know, I think among the black people I've known, not all of them, sometimes you meet, you know, a certain kind of university educated person who walks around with a city block on their shoulders. But among just common black people, they don't mind talking about stuff. They don't mind the give and take. They don't mind the teasing. They don't, you know, they're open. And I don't mind, you know, them pushing back at me or whatever, you know, it's this other class of people that is kind of like, I often look at it as, you know, it's amazing how much of it comes out of feminism. And it's the kind of feminism that was the temperance movement. You know, that's where the ancestors of so much of this comes from. It's that shaming people. It's amazing to me that sometime during the middle of, you know, so many of these different movements, the word shame comes out. And it was just, and you'd hear like people get together and would just chant shame, 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 shame. And I would think like, oh, of course, I'm thinking of there's a moment in the Game of Thrones, which is pretty bizarre, where a naked woman has to walk through the streets and everyone's yelling shame, shame, shame. But you realize how irrational that is, and how that kind of a thing, you know. But anyway, we're going off onto talking about the events of the day. What do you think that, you know, and of course you also started the Estuary. Maybe you can just define that a little bit more, what that was about. Because, okay, there's 2 things. First, there's the interviews, which I think come first. What gave you the impetus to start interviews? And then how did you move it into Estuary?
Well, like I did with my blog, I found Jordan Peterson, and I found his work very interesting on lots of different levels, you know, really far beyond the pronouns. I mean, that's what gave him all the lift, but I found his work very interesting. I hadn't really heard work like that before. And so I wanted to find conversation partners about it. And I, had little clusters of people that I could talk to about different things that I was interested in, but not really a lot of Jordan Peterson people to talk to, because saying, why don't you watch 100 hours of this guy's videos and we'll have a conversation?
Right.
That doesn't go far.
No.
And so I thought, and I'm just playing around with stuff. I'll make a YouTube video. And then I was I had been pouring stuff out into the internet for a long time, and not much ever came back. A little bit in the denomination. And then suddenly there's this flood that's coming back. And it's like, oh, what did I do? I don't know if this is a good idea. And so then people are just, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you. We need to talk, because people had all this stuff going on in their lives. They needed to talk to someone, and they didn't have anyone they could talk to.
Well, the truth is, that's how I found you, because if you typed in Jordan Peterson and Christianity, there was a time when the YouTube algorithm was just so nice to you. And you would be one of the first people that someone would find when they type those two things in together. And that's how I found you. And in fact, I kind of got the idea to start this channel after watching you for a while, because I said, if Paul can do this, I can do this. I have a few things on my mind. And in fact, what I did was I put a couple of videos down, and then I said, let me get in touch with this guy, Paul, and let's see if he can do an interview. And that would help give my little teeny channel a boost, So I went from having 14 followers to having, 50. So
you never get as much boost as you think you will.
No, but still, obviously the Peterson stuff gave you a huge boost, and then there were all these people that wanted to talk to you. So then I'm having these conversations. Like, if we weren't recording this, like we're doing now, we just right.
have these conversations,
right?
And then I'm having more and more of these conversations, and it's kind of like I'm sort of having to repeat myself a lot here.
Right.
It's getting a little boring for me. So and then it was like, I bet you there's lots of, just by virtue of the email messages I was get, there are definitely patterns out there of what people wanted to talk about.
Sure.
And people felt very lonely. So I just began, do you mind if we record this? And they'd say, some would say, some of it wasn't appropriate, but others say, oh, we can record it. So then we'd record it, and I'd send it back to them. And I thought, I bet you other people would want to see it, how to share it. So do you mind if I'd share it on my channel? No. But then once that happened, people watched, and I still have a lot of people who want to talk to me, just partly to get on my channel because they wanted a podcast or something. And then people would then now start writing back and say, wow, it was really helpful for me to listen to you talk to that person. Mm-hmm. But very quickly, because I don't know who I'm talking to, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. But that's just being a pastor. So then I find what's interesting, I pull their story out of them. Right.
Well, I've often noticed while you're talking to someone, you never know the motivation for someone who wants to talk to you. And sometimes they want to, as you would put it, colonize your channel for their ends. Other times it's a person who doesn't really know. They start off talking about one thing and then they'll shift to another. And it's really fascinating to watch your face it's almost like you can see the little thing click in your mind going, okay, that's where we're going. which is great. I think one of the things that makes one of the things I really appreciate is your ability to listen to all sides. And I've often told people, hey, I don't mind talking to an atheist. I don't mind talking to a Satanist. I don't mind talking to a communist. I don't mind talking to a Muslim. I don't mind talking to, there are probably some denominations of Christianity. But no, not really. Although Christians sometimes, although I am one, they will immediately want to purity test you from their specific, they'll, and I'm sure you've gotten a lot of, stuff. You get probably some of your sharpest jabs from people from Christian denominations who are going like, wait a minute, do you not believe in a 7-day, 24-hour creation? Wait a minute. Are you saying, why are you letting this? I know you get this. Like if you let someone like, I think Sam, who I actually talked to on my channel, I did an interview with, because like I say, same principle. It's like, I don't care who I talk to. It's a human conversation. It's worth having. And maybe something I have is good for him, but maybe he's got something too. But I know that when Sam was like, he's not Trinitarian, and it's like you could just see the meter go.
Well, it's both very interesting and ironically, a lot of things I can talk about that won't necessarily put my confessional status in jeopardy, but the Trinity, it's like,
right.
Oh boy,
right.
Oh boy, Sam. And people who would deal with atheists of various stripes, once the community started developing, and Sam comes along and they're like, it's like all of this, it's like these antibodies that were all the way going back to Nicaea suddenly just rear up and attack poor Sam.
Oh yeah. And when in our conversation, I didn't bring it up. I knew what group he had been a part of, and he wanted to talk about the Jesus movement, and I was ready. If he had wanted to slide that direction, I was going to go, okay, well, this is how this group fit in, or rather was on the side of it, kind of leeching off of it. It's like, but it wasn't. And at the same time, I found him very honest. I enjoyed talking with him. I had no problem whatsoever. And I used to, for instance, even in high school, I would spend a long time talking to Jehovah's Witnesses, who are among the crankiest and most literalistic people. And I often found, like, when they come to your door, I remember there was one in Alaska, and they the way they wanted to start a church was they brought 40 people up there. And then they started a church, and then they would start infiltrate the community and start talking to people. So this one guy, we started talking. He says, yeah, I'm with the Jehovah's Witness Church. Like this is a natural, organic thing in the community. No, they literally just shipped these people all up there to start the church to make it look like there was already a body there. But he says, I would like to come over with you. And he showed me like one of the Watchtower things. I'd like to talk with you about what's happening with the occult and stuff. And I said, okay, I would be very interested to hear that. And I didn't tell him anything about myself. I just figured, like, great. So he comes over to my house. And the thing is, if you walk into my house, the first thing that hits you is 7,000 or 8,000 albums and 6,000 CDs and a room full of movies. And, oh, there's the book library. And if you want to talk about the occult, I can pull out, here's this pseudo Bible that a guy wrote in a hypnotic trance in 1870 called Owaspy. And, here's the books on serial killers. And, it's just like, I can go, but I'm just simply, he walks in and suddenly he realizes, he starts talking to me. And then what I do is I would just sit there. When he was making a good point, I'd say, yeah, and that's what happened when the Fox sisters started doing this in 1849, or when they started doing spiritualism. This became a massive trend, which continues on to this day, although I didn't tell them that. And where do you think the Jehovah's Witnesses are born in? They're born in the Second Awakening, and the burned over area of New York State, upstate. But and so then after that, we remained very friendly. But then he suddenly realized, and I didn't. Usually he would say the kind of things they would say, which they would say, like, Jesus was crucified on a Roman torture stake. And I remember saying once to a Jehovah's Witnesses, they were trying so hard to make the point it wasn't a cross, it was a Roman torture stake. And I just said, I really don't care if it was a telephone pole. He still died for our sins. What do why are you getting hung up on this stuff? But that's those guys. But anyway, I don't know why I got to talking about that. But it's about conversation. That's what it's about.
And so I also get, I always wanted churches to be places where people could say what's on their mind and not have to play too many games.
Right.
Because as a pastor, again, because of how churches are the way they are, you can sort of, in a cheap way, gain status by saying all of certain words and phrases and things to just, this is, so say we all, this is what we all do, and yada, yada, yada. And as a pastor, you learn people believe all kinds of things. I mean, they're all over the map. I used to, every now and then, a Jehovah's Witness would come in and bring him in, and if I had the time, and sit down, and then I'd start asking them some questions about, well, what about this? And very quickly you learn that they had a certain level, most of them had a certain level of sort of education and indoctrination into this thing. But if you go a little bit deeper, suddenly things get squirrely, and everybody's like that. I mean, and so I think in church, I like to have real conversations with people. And I think for me, Estuary was a way to conceptualize that, and especially give church people a justification for doing something that wasn't sort of overtly tribalistic, or, as they would say, evangelistic. Just sit down and have some conversations with these people and become their friends. And in my experience over time, the other kind of stuff will usually sort itself out, but you'll actually be of much more use to the people around you, whether or not they finally join your church, than if you just say, here's the program, yes or no. When you're ready to say yes, we'll be here.
Right. I found it really fascinating when you had you expressed your very clear doubts about psychedelics. And that really, I took a lot of heat because of my thing. I think there was over 100 comments on mine because I was so very clearly not in favor of psychedelics because of my experiences in growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area. But what struck me immediately was like, ooh, I just stepped on a big religious toe. You stepped on a big religious toe, and this is a growing religious toe, that people are saying, we're going to find it. And I'm sitting there going like, yeah,
really?
I'd like to take you to Warsaw in 1944.
Psychedelics have never been done.
Yeah. But, I'd like to just take you to some horrendous situation, go like, here, have some psychedelics and appreciate this stuff, But so obviously this whole chapter of YouTube and the Estuary is inviting people in, and you do that mostly through the Discord, would you say?
Yeah, I've got to restart. I mean, COVID threw a big wrench into everything, of course.
Right.
Because that's face-to-face meeting, and the Discord.
Yeah.
The Discord's supposed to, help facilitate some things, but it's a fairly narrow group of people who have the time and interest and motivation to really dig deep into something like a Discord.
Right. But how would you say that this last period has affected you? That this whole YouTube experience with, because obviously you've got more than a couple of followers these days, and you get a lot of, you're not actually a celebrity. You don't walk out of your house. Although I do imagine a few people might make the pilgrimage to Living Stones.
Some do. And that's delightful. It's delightful.
Yeah.
I think in some ways, it's obviously been deeply meaningful because I've always wrestled with those ideas. I've done it with far fewer people and in far more obscure corners.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, if there's I don't know. I don't really know. I'm not going to stop, partly because I don't think that I can, because this is all sort of an outgrowth of who I've always been.
Right.
I've always wanted to know. And I've always had a deep respect for people. And so, if I say something like, well, I think it's Christian to love your racist neighbor, people, no, love your neighbor except the racists. No, I don't think Jesus thought that way, because if you think about the first century Galilean Judean culture war, you read Luke 15. I mean, you can't read the Gospels understanding the conflicts of their day and walk away not understanding how radical Jesus was,
Right.
and both the beauty and rigor of the discipleship that he sets in motion. So, and now I'm doing this just with a far more people sort of watching me and some wanting to play along. So that's delightful.
Mm-hmm.
But, some of the, I guess part of what I realize is some of the lessons I learned in the Dominican Republic are just as true here, just with better painkillers and more money. That I have, so often people sort of want to shortcut, well, Jesus and the Bible and the resurrection, that's just all about rearranging the furniture in this world. And everything that I've lived with, watching my father's ministry, the Dominican Republic, African-American experience in America, something deep inside of me says I'm not going along with that. I am going to continue to believe stubbornly, doggedly, that the God of this universe has better plans for his suffering people than this world can offer.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the doubt and the pessimism, but if those things are true, if this world really is all there's going to be for those of us walking around in it right now, that's a far darker thought than anything I'm willing to live with.
Right. Yeah. My feeling is that what modernism has done is it starts people with doubt. That is to say, it says, I can't know anything. What, can I even understand what I'm looking at? Everything is doubted. And so you slowly have to, whether Descartes, I think, therefore I am, or whether it's Nietzsche, or whether it's, some punk rocker screaming at the top of his lungs. To me, you can't start with doubt. You have to start with trust and faith. And that is to say, a person says, well, I don't trust anything. I said, yeah, you do. You trust that your legs are carrying you down the street. You trust when your car is going down the road, that the road is there. So you start with, if that's all you can trust, but you start with that. So like, okay, this means something. But I think you can start with much more than that. One of the problems with the modernism was that it said, essentially, we're going to pull everything apart. And they did this in science, and they did this in art, and they did this in theology. We're going to pull it all apart, see where it all comes from. And then, of course, the problem is, it's like when you dig a hole, you can't put all the dirt back in the hole without leaving a lump, because you've rearranged the molecules. Well, it's the same with all these things that have been pulled apart in the modernist quest for to understand every little thing, and also to doubt every little thing, is that, you've taken it all apart. But in fact, and then you try to say, this, I am explained through DNA. I am explained through my chemistry. I am explained through, evolution. But here's the thing, you wouldn't even know that if you didn't have a brain. You have to start with that. You have to start with and this is what Michael Polanyi says in Personal Knowledge, is that he calls it, what does he call it again? I'm forgetting it. But you start with, you don't start with the little to explain the big. You have to start with the big to explain the little. So for instance, the most complicated thing I know of in the material universe is my brain. It is more complex than the Big Bang. It is more complex, and we have you have to start with the fact that I'm walking around in this thing that is so complex. That's how I can understand something like DNA. DNA may be a building block, but, for instance, in language, people often think mistakenly that, because we have these syllables, that you can pull the syllables apart and everything was originally a syllable, like there or there or there. But that's not true. It's actually the words, and it's us trying to understand them that have pulled the syllables apart. But the language was there before the little words, the little syllables. And it's this idea. And then, of course, the postmodern idea comes along and says, well, there are so many interpretations of all this stuff. And so when we reassemble it, we can reassemble it in any manner we see fit, because after all, it's all essentially, well, it all depends on your narrative, although I think the word spin works a lot better for what their narratives are, But once you start with the fact of, I am this amazing creature filled with mysteries, living with a brain size of a universe in my head that performs operations that the greatest computers on earth can't even touch. And that's where I start. I start with the fact that there are things much greater than I am. And here's the thing. Here's the mystery. I can talk to you through something that we made literally halfway across the world. I mean, just that fact ought to let you know that it isn't about the little things inside of the computer. It's about the people why did they make this thing? They made it in order for us to communicate. Well, but they didn't know what we would do with it. Yeah. And of course, they also didn't know all the problems that would be generated by the internet. Back when people had this utopian vision, that's one of the problems, is always utopian visions. But to kind of conclude, do you have any thoughts about where you'd like to go from here, or like things that you'd like to try, or any thoughts about what the future might hold in this? Well, it really is a ministry,
I don't know. I'd like to write. I'd like to, I made this 3-hour video on, give it my channel, my monologue videos on my channel are me thinking out loud. And right. That's what they really are. And I would like to, and then I also, most of the writing I do in private. And actually John Van Donk texted me yesterday and said, you're a lot. What did he say to me? He said it quite well, because Van Donk's a pretty sharp cookie. He texts me and he says, am I the only one who thinks your writing on CRC Voices seems more cogent than you're talking on your channel? I said, John, I know it is. And that's what's so strange about the whole thing.
Writing stills.
Yeah, that's right. And so when I write things, I actually have to sort of bring things down and organize it. But I've been writing forever, and a lot of my writing is sort of off draft too. I really need to come to a point of maturity where I can sit down and produce something that is stable. Mm-hmm. And I want to, at least at some point, give that to the world.
You should.
I don't know when that will happen, but because I really, let's see, what do I want? I'm a Christian minister at the heart of me, and I want people to believe that God loves them, and I want people to stop white knuckling this world and begin to dare to love each other in some ways irresponsibly, because I think that's what's at the heart of the gospel, mm-hmm. where Jesus didn't white knuckle his life, but said, I'm going to release myself into these people that certainly don't deserve me. And all of that is going to result in my resurrection, which will be the beginning of a far greater and better world than the one we enjoy now. Mm-hmm. And I want people to be filled with that knowledge to the degree that they can do what he did. That's what I want. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And along the way, I love the conversations. I love meeting new people. I'm frustrated by the bandwidth limitations of our lifetimes here and now, because there really are so very many interesting people. And part of what's been delightful about the conversations is, I put out a link into the world and boom, here's a rando. I have no idea who, just learn it, just getting to know you, Burn Power. And I thought, is that a real name? And then you're in Tbilisi, Georgia. And what's so fun is you're a lot like a deep friend of mine who used to be in this church because he passed. Mm-hmm. But he was the opera and classical buyer for Tower Records in its heyday. Mm-hmm. And he went to my church here. And when he died, he left his poor widow with, tens of thousands of records and tapes and CDs and videos. And because he was just like you, he could just take in this stuff. Right, and so, and so on one hand, I want people to know this great thing, which is the gospel. And at the same time, already right now, we are just so richly blessed in this world with people like you and even people, people like the annoying homeless guy or Freddie or Job.
Right.
Or, this world is just so packed with amazing people.
I was just binge watching The Crown recently. I'd never seen it. And so I watched all 4 seasons at once. Now I'm sitting there going like, hey, wait a minute. The story's not done yet. But I thought to myself, a lot of people get hooked on fantasy stories, and as much as I love Tolkien or Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia, or, any number of fantasy and horror stories, I'm sitting there going, and people will spend ages and ages kind of trapped in these worlds, trying to live as if they were in that world because they find these worlds fascinating. It does something for them in a mythological sense. And I'm watching this, I'm sitting there going like, but they're missing the real epic. And the real epic is right outside your door. Yeah. And it's also in your head. And it's also in your relationships. And it's in the times changing. Someone commented last year, it's just like, I really wish I could be in the 60s. I said, skip the airfare, you're there. This is, this recent period is going to be a time people are going to puzzle over like they puzzle over the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like, if you could just get that idea of where you are in history and how much has happened, it's kind of like I was thinking about, what is it? Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. I'm sitting there going like, and the whole hero's journey. And I'm sitting there going like, that is way too limited. You should look at the real world and see how it plays out. Like the Princess Diana story, doesn't fit at all the hero's journey or anything like that. You have the naive girl who's really beautiful and she's just charm incorporated, just absolutely dazzling, and is sitting at home puking her guts out, trying to keep the food. They didn't show her cutting herself. But it's kind of like, and then you have her husband who can't see it, or he sees it. It's like a distance because he's living in his own dream. And yet people are touched by this story, and you just say, wow, what a world we live in. And that's just one tiny story of a few people who live in this very lonely existence called royalty, And I think about my life compared to theirs. I'm going like, I got the good deal. I didn't get any money growing up. It's like when you look at the cards we're dealt, everyone's dealt with cards. Sometimes you get to put a few down, pick a few up. But, I look at the cards I was dealt with. It's just like, okay, I didn't get the money card. I didn't get the education card. But I did get the curiosity card. And I did get at least I'm intelligent enough to appreciate all this stuff. And I am creative as hell. So, yeah. And I know how to get around the world wherever I need to get to. It's just like, I'm doing well, my life is not in a fishbowl like that, So anyway, Paul, I wanted to do this because I really appreciate your work.
Oh,
and I think you've done something unique because it's this idea of getting people to talk. It's like, Jordan Peterson's always saying, what is it I'm doing? People don't get it. They're always saying it's the right wing. I'm an alt-right this, they're always misinterpreting it. But the truth is, I mean, he really changed the nature of the way we appreciate videos. I mean, he's got 2.5-hour videos about the Bible, and people started watching all of them. And there's 1 million views on some of them, 2 million views. That's pretty amazing, which then opens the door for people like us to make some long-assed videos. But to also, like I've got people who follow my channel, and I often get people saying, wow, I can't believe you're doing what you're doing. And I think you get those people as well. Yeah. And it's just, you just say like, that's really good. Yeah. It is good that something we have inside of us can communicate. And I just wanted to say thanks. And also, because I love history and I love this larger epic, I just wanted to get a little bit of Paul's little teensy part in.
Hang on a second. I'll be right there.
The epic.
All right.
Take care.
Somebody really wants to talk to me.
All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, Paul had to go. I actually even cut out a little bit there where it was just like someone was on the knocking at the door really furiously, and I'm guessing it might have been one of Paul's locals, shall we say. That was a great discussion, though, and I really appreciated Paul being there and giving his time, which he is often very generous with, and having a discussion. I learned a lot about Paul's history as well. I hope you did too. And if you haven't, go find his channel. And if you want to subscribe to that, chances are if you found this, you already subscribed to his channel. But you could subscribe to mine. You could support me, share the video, do whatever. But we'll see you again soon in the not too distant future. And I hope you are all doing well during these remarkably bizarre times. And this is Byrne reminding you, the Anadromist's life means swimming against the stream. Why don't you do that?
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.